So covenant members were under the law. Covenant members were under the curse if they broke the law. Covenant members were under grace if they decided to come under the new headship of Jesus. When we look into Romans chapter 6, and here we have verse 14, it says here, "For sin shall not be your master, because you are not under law, but under grace." What is Paul speaking of here under grace? See, God is gracious. That's just his character. God is merciful. God is love. God is all of these things. But that's not what I'm talking to here about being under grace. This is very specific in its covenantal language to the covenantal members, that what happened, all the body of Moses, or the corporate body, the collective covenantal members, they were all in death because they had broken the covenantal system and their relationship with God was severed and they were in death position. The only way to bring them out of that was to fulfill the debt that they had accumulated. And so Jesus came to pay off that debt. And how he paid that debt off was that he went to the cross when he resurrected from the dead on the third day. That resurrection for Jesus was physical. It was a symbolic resurrection. Although past, the covenantal language of resurrection was symbolic. It was talking about, hey, you're dead in this relationship, but now you need to come alive. Jesus talked about this with Nicodemus. You must be born again. Why is he saying this to Nicodemus? Because Nicodemus was in the body of Moses, meaning the whole, the under the law system. He was under that, and they had broken the law, so they were in a death position. They had to be resurrected. They had to die, and they had to be resurrected out of Moses into Jesus. So this resurrection language is very key in that it is symbolic. It's a metaphor for this covenantal relationship. But when Jesus died on the cross, he actually did physically pay off that debt. And when he rose from the dead, that was a physical resurrection to prove to his covenantal people that he was the one that showed the Father to them, that he was the one that paid off the debt, and that now a new covenant was going to be given to them. And this is now where we enter into this language of being under grace. What does being under grace mean? Well, when Jesus comes and he's baptized, he begins his ministry. Here, he is operating under a new covenantal system. At that moment, Jesus is the new king of Judea, okay? Spiritually speaking, he is that new king. He is there for 3.5 years of doing this ministry. And as he is there, he tells them that it is within that generation when heaven and earth will pass away, but his words will never pass away. We know that heaven and earth is speaking of the temple system, the covenantal system that they were under, this old covenantal system, and that all of that was going to pass away because once the new covenant system came, that was the new heaven and the new earth. So Jesus here, he gives them fair forewarning that for a whole generation, 40 years, in that time, you have 30 AD all the way to 70 AD. In that time of 40 years, that you had covenant members, either they were going to come into the new covenant under the new head of Jesus, or they were going to deny that and remain under the head of Moses. And if you were going to do that, then you were dead because that whole old covenant system was no more. And so you have a death and life situation here. But in that 40-year time frame from 30 AD to 70 AD, you had a grace period. Now, let me share this with you. I remember when I finished and I graduated from graduate school, I had a school loan that I had to pay off. And immediately when I graduated, there was a 6-month grace period. And, when you graduate, you're looking for a job, you're settling in and all this stuff. And so they give you, this was like a Pell Grant. And so they give you a 6-month and they call it a grace period. What is that grace period? It's just giving you a time, 6 months, where you don't have to pay. any of the loan. And it wasn't until the 6 months was done that then the payment started to come. And I got a notice, like, I don't know, like a couple months before, telling me when the first payment was going to be. And so I prepared for that. And so when it was time, I started to pay off the debt, right? And so Jesus is saying, in the 40 years, I'm going to place you under grace, a position of grace. And I'm not going to charge you for if you're going to be under me or be under Moses, which is a dead system now. And I'm you're going to be under grace, and I'm going to cover you at this time. And so Jesus did that for everyone and gave them that grace period to make up their mind to decide if you're going to come under Jesus or not, if you're going to come under the new covenant or not. And as we know, most of them did not, but the elect and the remnant, they did. And they did enter into the new kingdom. They did enter into new heaven and new earth, this whole new covenant system headed by Jesus. And that 40-year period was the grace period. And so this is why no judgment had come. Until that 40-year time frame had passed, because that was the grace period. And when that grace period had ended, this is now when Titus comes into Rome, and what happens? The judgment comes. And it's just a judgment where God is the judge, and he opens up the book, and he recognizes and he sees that, okay, they need to pay the debt that they have been accruing all of this time. Jesus paid it on their behalf, but they rejected that payment. They were under that debt, right, of transgression and sin. And so therefore, the judgment had come where now physically they were going to be put to death. That was the judgment call according to the stipulations of their law system, right? Because they were under the law. They were under the curse. They refused to be under grace. So then they were put to death in 70 AD. And that whole system had come to an end because they didn't need it anymore. Now, under the new covenant system, it was where God was now dwelling with man, not in a temple, not in a ritual, not in any religious system, but through God's presence. This was the good news. This was the promise, but only for those that believed, that had faith. Those that didn't, they didn't get to enter in, okay? Because that was the rules. That was the law that they were under, that they had to abide by. So who were those that were under grace? It was those, that whole covenant community membership. They were under that grace period for that time. God gave them 40 years, one generation. And surely enough, those that they entered into the new kingdom. They were already in the kingdom, meaning that God was already with them, and they recognized that. It was a whole new way of actually relating with God. And so those that did not, then they were judged, and they were, they got the judgment that they deserved. And that was the end. That was the fulfillment of Revelation. So those that were under grace, it was the covenant members that were under grace. Am I saying now today that God's not gracious, that God's not merciful? No, that's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just trying to get you familiar with the biblical language and the covenant language of the Bible and what the Bible is trying to say about being under grace and how important it was for us to recognize that God had actually given them that grace period before they had to pay off the debt. And if you couldn't pay off the debt, then what did the death bring? It brought about death. Debt brought death. And that is exactly what happened to them, thus fulfilling the very word of God, that this is what he was going to do. And they had signed the agreement, and this was their covenantal system because they were under that law.